Hey, it's Michelle Malkin for a double header today. Malkin live streaming. You saw me at lunchtime, well, lunchtime Mountain Time, and I am back because if you were tuned into my Twitter account over the weekend, you saw that I gave a little bit of a snippet of a live stream I had done last week. My rejoinder to the Silicon Valley censors who are cracking down on whistleblowers, truth tellers, dissidents, pushing back against what I've called the public health industrial complex. And I promised you that I was going to do everything in my power to use my platform to give voice to those who have been silenced, who've been squelched, and in some very encouraging cases, who are transcending and triumphing over those gatekeepers and those squelchers. And one of those people is Dr. Judy Mikovits, who is the co-author of the book Plague of Corruption. I've been talking to you about this for weeks now, a book that she co-authored with Kent Heckenlively. It is so relevant, of course, to our times in this pandemic age when the so-called experts are ruling our lives and where there is very little scrutiny about the financial and ideological motives that are driving them. There's also been very little good and trustworthy journalism in the so-called mainstream press about the history of many of the key players. And of course, Anthony Fauci is one of them. Dr. Judy Mikovits has a lot to say and a lot of knowledge about that. So I'm going to bring her in right now. Hi, Dr. Mikovits, how are you?
Hi, Michelle. I'm doing well today. Thank you.
I'm so glad that you were able to take the time to do this. We've got a half hour to pack in as much information. Now, we don't know if this live stream, which is going on right now on Twitter and Periscope, as well as YouTube, how long it's going to be up, what it's going to be labeled. And I thought I would start out with a tweet from a CNN reporter this weekend, a young man named Donnie O'Sullivan, who seemingly was crowing. I mean, it sounds almost triumphant, his tweet here. Facebook and YouTube say they are removing that false viral Plandemic video you probably have seen in your social media feeds. Twitter, however, says the video doesn't break its COVID-19 misinformation rules. Plandemicmovie.com, I think is the website, right?
Correct.
Correct. Where the first installment is available to anyone. Lots of people were trying to post it to YouTube. It kept getting yanked down. People put it on Facebook. It kept getting yanked down. But it's almost like whack-a-mole because nothing these people have done has been able to block people from seeing the truth. Tell us about what's going on with this.
Well, Michelle, this Plandemic, the movie was the preview of my description and other scientists' description of what is scientifically being censored, the censorship of the work that shows in COVID-19 and in other pandemics, that in fact these have been for more than 30 years plandemics, and really what we call a plague of corruption. That's why the title of the book. It's not science, it's politic, it's censorship of honest scientists, and this is what's going on with it. They don't want you to know this information. And in fact, this is the second book we've written. The first one was called Plague, and this is about literally about our groundbreaking discoveries of mouse cancer causing viruses, the publication in a journal Science. And when it became clear that of the number of strains of these mouse cancer causing and neuroimmune disease causing viruses that had entered the human virome by way of a contaminated blood supply and contaminated vaccines with lots of animal tissues and lots of different viruses, they needed to shut this down because, of course, this this is exactly what happened. What is, COVID-19, a coronavirus that entered the human virome in a way that wasn't natural. That is not a natural evolution of a virus that's being sold as anything but. So what happened is the same kind of huge media attack that happened to me in 2011 and 12, and that what resulted in the destruction of my entire stellar career in cancer and AIDS research and drug development. So it's no different today than it was in 2012, when these same people with fake, it's false journalism, and in the scientific journal, it's even fraud. I call it commission fraud. And you can walk right through Science, the journal, Nature, the journal, and see how the insiders, not the papers themselves, but the papers themselves that are commissioned by Tony Fauci and NIAID, with funding, with withholding funding, and with awarding people who either turn their back on this fraud or ignore it, or have actually perpetrated the fraud, with tens of millions of dollars in grants. And as I've said in that movie, they've paid. So those who are honest and have integrity lose everything, and their careers are destroyed. Character assassination, with no discussion of the ideas and the actual data at all.
So there's a long history of whistleblowers and dissidents within the scientific community who've had their lives ruined and their careers sabotaged, like you. And yours is so extraordinary because you were put in prison for no reason. Can you give the viewers, many of whom will not have had a chance to watch the first installment of Plandemic yet, could you give sort of a thumbnail of what led up to that moment where the authorities came to your home?
Yeah, I was put in jail. What led up to that moment is I was told back in September by the heads of the Blood Systems Research Institute and the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood Disease to misrepresent data that said the blood supply was heavily contaminated with this new family of mouse cancer and AIDS and neuroimmune disease causing viruses that we had isolated and published only 2 years earlier. When the data became clear that this virus it was in the human virome by a contaminated blood supply that could have been contaminated for 30 years, 25 times more people were infected than in HIV/AIDS at the height of HIV in this country in 1991. So as the data emerged that likely these mouse viruses got into humans by way of contaminated vaccines, then of course the hammer began to fall where publications were published, and I was told to deny the data, to misrepresent the data, to throw the data away. And when I refused to do so, I was fired. My lab was locked down on September 29th, and 2 offices and my entire 30-year career and everything, my notebooks, everything was confiscated. At that point, I was threatened throughout that 6 weeks, and on November 18th, or on November 4th, I was served with a civil lawsuit that said I had stolen intellectual property and had removed things from the lab. When my lawyer responded and said, that's impossible, here are actually the facts, it was revealed basically that they had gotten caught, my employers had gotten caught with literally fabricating this crime. And so a week later, after that letter was faxed to them saying, no, I couldn't possibly have done that, then I'm arrested at the door with no warrant, as I'm surrounded by police cars. My house is, the water has the harbor patrol in it. There's no warrant. My husband's pushed into a chair. They search my entire house. They take me away in foot shackles and hand shackles in front of the entire neighborhood, who all said they knew something was going on because of the amount of, force that was used. I was held in jail for 5 days in Ventura County without bail, on a bail hold, without the possibility, never saw a judge, never saw a lawyer. And the charges that were reported in the journal Science on November 19th, 2011, in Science Insider by John Cohen, Cohen, was that nobody filed the warrant. Meaning not Ventura County, not Sparks, not Reno, where the institute, my employers were, not Washoe County. And the only thing they could conclude was that these felony charges for fugitive from justice had to come from one of several federal agencies. So I'm held on felony charges of a fugitive from justice, and I don't so much as have a parking ticket. You have to base a charge like that on something. It was based on nothing. NIH, the NIH and the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland, when I went, that they still say I'm a fugitive from justice, or did the last time I was there, which was November 15th, 2016, when I went to go to Fort Detrick, to the laboratories where I worked for 22 years, literally my last job was as the director of the internationally acclaimed lab of antiviral drug mechanisms, where we made drugs for AIDS associated cancers and did much pioneering research in the 2 years there when I developed that lab. So so on 5 years after these false charges were filed, these felony fugitive from justice still stands, such that I can't work. Those felony charges were used throughout 2011 and 12, again, baseless, with no backup. You can't be a fugitive from justice if you don't have a parking ticket, is what I usually say, or anything else, nothing ever. So the kind of power that could be unleashed on me to say this, and then we see, whatever Wikipedia or the news reports, the Washington Post that says, no, I was arrested for stealing notebooks. No, I wasn't. Go to the record. And she refused to do that. That is, Katie Shepard of the Washington Post. She refused to simply look at the article. And if you go look in Ventura at the charges, they were, there was no charge for possession. There was no charge for stealing. Everything about what was done to me in 2011 and 12 was to keep me from participating in a multi-center study that would have shown our research to have been true, and that in fact that these mouse cancer causing viruses that were contagious in the time of 2010 and 11, we learned they were contagious. You could actually cough cancer on somebody, take that in, or you can share glasses and drinking and have the entire family get sick. And we see, I've worked my entire life in translational research settings. That is where we have doctors, nurses, PharmDs, PhDs, technicians, ever since I was an entry-level technician, developing immune therapies. That I developed, part of the team that developed the first interferon alpha, that is a curative therapy for a kind of leukemia. So these were the teams I was on in '83 when I worked with HIV, confirming the isolation from Luc Montagnier of a new retrovirus that was associated, what was then called gay related immune deficiency. All of this was what's described in the movie, this pattern of cover up and corruption by government officials. And they're the same government officials who, lowered this boom on me, heavy handed. And you can
Yeah.
see right there in Science, the journal, they continued 23 articles between the time I gave the talk at the New York Academy of Sciences on the contamination of the blood supply. And in that same meeting, I talked about a technology that a company in the US had that could clean up the blood supply. I was taught to have a solution. That's what I do. I don't simply talk about problems, we solve them. And
Right.
it was paradigm shifting. So the persecution and the cover up, over 23 articles from the time of federal agencies. We have a quote of a former CDC employee saying federal agencies are scared to death if XMRV works out. Oh, wait a minute. Who arrested me and put a fugitive from justice charge on? One of several federal agencies, reported right there in Science. And then you can continue to walk through the next 2 years and see how against all odds of not even being able to go in a lab, we would have found in that multi-center study, the last center was the only legitimate patient group. It was run by Dr. Montoya. It was the Stanford Center. And when we got these samples positive, late in the study, against all odds, Tony Fauci shut down the study, literally stopped the study, said we've wasted enough money. And then worse than that, far worse than that, he told us that of the 1,000 samples we tested so far, we had an equal number from every center in the study, which was an out and out lie and out and out fraud. We would have validated this. So we then went to a press conference where we were going to. I should step back. When the study was unblinded, there was a very super secret phone call, a conference call with Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, and Harold Varmus. Harold Varmus was the head of the National Cancer Institute, where my colleague worked throughout these studies. Of course, Francis Collins is the one that directed Tony Fauci to fund this study back in September of 2010, when I presented a group from London, a study in a patient cohort from London where 4% of the controls were positive. And what's important about that is Francis Collins asked me during that XMRV workshop, which was held September 6th and 7th at the NIH Clinical Center, where I got the controls was the only question he asked. I said the blood supply. So again, and during this super secret conference call, we were all told there was no association. And this was after we were told every study center was equally represented. We know that he stopped the study and we would have found more than 80% positive. And I said during that phone call, I said, that's okay. 6% is still 25 million Americans at that time. Our table 3 of the study that was published in September and October in MBio is the journal. It's called MBio by Ian Lipkin. The abstract of the paper said there was no evidence of XMRVs found by any group. Clearly, on table 3 of that paper, there was 6.1% in the patients and 6.1% in the controls. So yes, there was no association, but we still every single study that was ever done showed between 4 and 7.8% of the U.S. population was infected, were asymptomatic carriers, if you were, and some very, very ill with many, many cancers. So we're infected with mouse gamma cancer causing retroviruses. Sorry for the scientific term. That were contagious and most likely entered the human population by the contaminated blood supply, which we had proven, and vaccines, which one of our HIV/AIDS colleagues had reported in a journal in January of 2011 in an opinion paper. So this was and you can see every fraudulent thing. And so right after that study was published, Dr. Ian Lipkin was awarded by Tony Fauci a $34 million grant for the Centers for Discovery and Diagnostic, which, oh, by the way, is paying for the work on coronaviruses.
Yeah.
Some of the grant funding going to CIS. So the big cover up and what will go in great detail, not only in Plandemic, but in the book Plague of Corruption and the first book Plague, heavily referenced. Simon & Schuster, the publisher, Skyhorse, heavily legally covered. We make no money on the book because of the sheer cost of protecting every word. Every word is referenced. On the first book, we might have made 2 cents a copy, and I think we might have made $2,000 in this 4 years or 6 years it's been published. And of course, we spent hundreds, if not thousands, of hours working on it. And both books, both books tell the story, are completely referenced with facts. They're not my opinion; it's data. And so when we in the United States of America can't discuss interpretation of data and interpret data any other way than what we were told by a few at the very top who have significant conflicts of interest and power and have committed literal criminal fraud in these publications, as we know has happened for more than 30 years. And that's what the movie said in HVA, the criminal fraud against the gays, the criminal fraud of publications that denied treatments to people or delayed diagnostics while an entire continent of Africa got infected and died as patent rights were fought over, between two governments, really. And Kent Heck and Lively wrote another book called Inoculated, just himself, where he goes into the details of what happened with the 1986 National Vaccine Injury Compensation Plan.
Right. I'm going to stop you right there. And I want people to know who are just joining the live stream with us now, either on Twitter or YouTube, that the book is Plague of Corruption. And I want to read the endorsement from Luc Montagnier, who you mentioned, who's the 2008 Nobel laureate for the isolation of the HIV retrovirus. He writes, "This rampant corruption hides from the public scientific truths which might go against corporate economic interests." And of course, that's a theme of a lot of my investigative journalism over the years, whether it's on public health issues, education, immigration, whatever. You always have to follow the money to find the truth. On the back cover, there is an endorsement from Stephanie Seneff, who's a senior research scientist at MIT, their computer science and artificial intelligence laboratory. And she says, "What this book teaches you more than anything else is that science is a dangerous game. The notion that science is precise and unambiguous is wrong." And certainly more people's eyes have been open to that with the handling by all of these so-called experts around the world of the pandemic outbreak that's locked up people in our country, certainly millions and millions of people, and caused more damage than good. When there is doubt, Dr. Stephanie Seneff of MIT says there's the potential for powerful interested parties to make life miserable for a scientist with integrity. And that, of course, is you, as well as many of the brave medical professionals who were highlighted in part 1 of Plandemic movie, the Plandemic documentary that, again, for those of us who are just joining us, you can watch that first installment, about 25, 30 minutes at plandemicmovie.com. It's getting banned on all of the mainstream Silicon Valley channels, but you can watch it there. And one of the things that I found most powerful was the testimony of all of these doctors who are turning on their webcams and defying the establishment CDC propaganda about the need to lock every last person up in this country, whatever their risk factor actually is, and to wear masks even if they're in the middle of the Colorado Rockies, like where I am. And you talk a lot about this. And again, for a lay audience, I want you to try and make it as simple as possible. Your conclusions and your experience and what your research tells you about the best way to approach boosting immune resiliency. Because, of course, one of the dark forces, the nemesis in my mind, in my opinion, on all of this is Bill Gates, who is featured in the Plandemic Part 1, essentially deeming that we will all be hostages and slaves to this tyranny of experts until and unless we submit to his new mandatory vaccine regime. Talk about that.
Right. Well, I can talk about that because Bill Gates is not a medical professional. He hasn't spent 40 years in industry and at the National Cancer Institute developing therapeutics and discoveries, really paradigm shifting discoveries of how viruses cause disease. He has no opinion. The simple fact of all the measures that are being taken, fear is a very powerful immune suppressive. Fear, fear of losing your job, fear of other people, fear that a healthy person is going to make you sick. Yes, wearing a mask for the most vulnerable, it can be very dangerous as you go into breathing CO2 out and in. At some point becomes something called acidosis, and that again is further detrimental, especially if you're one of the people most susceptible, like people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. They can literally pass out driving a car, sitting there with a mask on because they're limiting. They can faint if it's a perfectly healthy construction worker in 90 degrees wearing this mask can fall off a ladder. The kind of damage that can happen and is not being considered, and then the fear of watching your life's work go down the drain, the frustration, the depression, not going out into sunshine, not boosting by hugging, by touching, that you have to stay 6 feet apart and fear people and who aren't wearing masks or even just be muzzled and wear that thing to say, that you're afraid enough. And when they finally push you with data that don't exist, it's very clear now that this virus isn't as dangerous as they said it was, and that we have very simple measures for keeping the most compromised safe, measures that have been around since, for the last 40 to 70 years with volumes of data supporting using type 1 interferons, hydroxychloroquine, simple vitamin C, simple zinc, lemon juice, vitamin D, going out in the sun, boosting your immune system by walking on the beach. The beaches are closed. How can you possibly, close bathrooms? I mean, sanitation was what helped us eliminate infectious disease as it spread through. Clean sanitation, clean food, clean water. Now we're stopping the farmers market so that all we can get is the glyphosate, the Roundup, the heavily toxic GMOs that we all know. So we're not only forced into these draconian measures, but we can't get clean food and clean air. We can't breathe clean air. We're made by God to breathe air. Plants give us, they absorb the CO2, and we're not allowed to go outside into the plants, eat healthy vegetables and plants in order to keep our immune systems strong.
And so what this really touches on, of course, is the fact that you can't patent and profit off of things like the sun. And this is the bottom line, isn't it? You mentioned in one of the last chapters of your book about the powerful influence of big pharma advertising in corporate media. So, and of course, this is not just limited to corporate media, it's social media as well. So I want to read this statistic to people. Spending on Facebook mobile ads alone by pharmaceutical brands reached nearly $1 billion in 2019, nearly tripling over 2 years. Facebook, of course, is one of the big Silicon Valley giants that is trying to stifle the information that you're trying to get to people in Plandemic documentary. And, you know, there are many other fellow travelers, dissidents who have raised questions about mandatory vaccine laws, mandatory vaccine schedules, the explosion of the vaccine schedule. For as long as my kids have been alive, I've got a daughter who's 19 and a son who's 16. And so many of these uncomfortable truths, which, as you say, are paradigm shifting. And when you shift paradigm, what do? You threaten all of these financial interests. So, you know, as we move forward here, you know, there are so many people who, I mean, I cannot tell you, Judy, how many people who've never been interested in these topics before have been emailing me the link to your work. Something happened. You know, it's just one of these, I think, providential confluence of events. And you've got polls now that show that more people than ever are rejecting the notion that they should hand over their arms for every last one of these jabs. That's number one. And number two, polls are showing that the distrust of the expert class is higher than ever. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think where we go from here is number one, for President Trump to repeal the 1986 Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which removed all liability for manufacturers. We now know, because of the work of Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Del Bigtree's I Can Decide network, who did Freedom of Information Act, that not a single safety test required by law has been done in the 34 years since the 1986 Act was passed. Every other year, everything on the schedule and the schedule itself was to be tested. This is how we do it when we add cancer drugs. Every time we add a drug to the protocol, you must test for drug interactions. This is not being done. So that to repeal the Bayh-Dole Act that allows these investigators who are receiving tens of millions of dollars of federal funds from taxpayers to patent their work and drive the science towards their patents and their money making. So those two single things can end all of this. And I say a 5-year moratorium on all vaccines until the safety testing has been done. I develop immune therapies successfully. That's what a vaccine is. It's educating the immune system to prevent or treat infectious disease or cancer. That is my 40-year career. And I'm not anti-vax, I'm safe-vax. We make safe medicine. And when scientists and doctors aren't censored or their careers destroyed because they receive grants from Tony Fauci if they go against, and then when those who are dishonest are rewarded, as our books show clearly, heavily referenced, and every single email shows the truth. When we're censored, and that's again 8 years now of I didn't just pop up yesterday. I never stopped fighting. In the middle of plague of corruption, there's an email I wrote on August 31st 2011, and I promised them I'd spend the rest of my life if they perpetrated this fraud against these innocent people again. And I say again because they killed millions with HIV, with H1N1, with the Ebola outbreak in Liberia. Millions of innocent people are dying with every one of these pandemics, and I'm the one that coined that term, plandemic, because you can see every one of them planned. You can follow it in the media. You could show the journal Science doing exactly, skewing with, oh, they say, oh, it's not us. Those are our freelance. No, Science Insider sent a message. 23 articles showing what would happen if a scientist decided to hold to the truth as I did. Far beyond the jailing, fraud, extortion into having me file bankruptcy with a perfect credit score. So I couldn't take my 97 witnesses to court and prove that I never did anything wrong. And you know who those 97 witnesses would have included? Yeah, Tony Fauci, every one of those doctors, 97, and when they had testified, if that hadn't happened, if these courts hadn't been bought, by our attorney general's offices, by the FBI, by the DOJ and the HHS are responsible for making certain that vaccine compensation program be legally run. And again, not a single part of that program has anything to do with following the law. In fact, with everything I saw, and I said it in the book, with everything I've experienced in the last decade, which is horrific, the worst thing I saw was vaccine court and what they do to these victims.
The book is Plague of Corruption. The documentary is Plandemic, which you can watch the first installment of at plannedemicmovie.com. As I said at the beginning of this, Judy, I have no idea how many people are actually going to watch this, but for the 10 years that I've been on Twitter, I had previously built up a following of about 2.1 million followers. I know that I'm shadow banned. I know you are too. They've done everything they can to try and stifle us. But, I think that I've always been one who has tried to use the platforms that I've had to give voice to the voiceless. And your voice is not being stifled. Obviously, from the comments I can see here, and I'm sure the feedback that you've gotten over the last several weeks, people are so grateful for your vigilance, for your bravery. I do urge, of course, everybody to do their own homework, do your own verification. That is the obligation, certainly, of every parent. And, my own journey in questioning these things has been public record. How I've come to arrive at the conclusions I have had about the financial motives that have corrupted the public health industrial complex. A lot of my longtime readers and viewers are very well aware of the corruption in the deep state, and the NIH and the federal scientific community and big pharma certainly are not exempt from that, not immune from that, as it were. So please keep doing the incredible work that you are doing. And I want to urge everybody to get this book. And #1 on Amazon, by the way, last week. Just an amazing phenomenon, given so many forces that are against you. And as you said, Judy, there will be subsequent installments of Plandemic movie coming out soon. So take care, be safe, and God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you, Michelle. Appreciate it so much.
Take care. Thanks. All right, I'll see you guys.